6. The Rhenish Diet. In the previous year the Diet of the Rhenish province had sat for 9 weeks in Düsseldorf, and in a series of 5 long treatises Marx now proceeded to elucidate its activities. The provincial diets were impotent, pseudo-representative bodies instituted by the Prussian crown to cloak the betrayal of its promise of 1815 to grant a constitution. They held their sessions behind closed doors and were permitted at the utmost to little say in petty communal affairs. However, since the trouble with the Catholic Church in Cologne and in Posen in 1837, the diets had not been convened at all. Opposition to the government, if it came at all, was to be expected only from the Rhenish and Posen diets, but even then only an ultramontane opposition. These worthy bodies were protected very effectively from liberalist aberrations by the provision that the possession of landed property was a necessary condition of membership. The country gentry were to provide 1/2 of the membership, the urban landowners 1/3 and the peasant landowners 1/6. However, this edifying principle could not be put into operation in all its glory everywhere, and in the newly won Rhineland, for instance, 1 or 2 concessions had to be made to the spirit of modernism. But always the country gentry provided over 1/3 of the membership, and in view of the fact that all the decisions of the diets had to be adopted with a 2/3 majority, nothing could be passed without their approval. Urban landowners were subjected to the further limitation that their land must have been in their uninterrupted possession for a period of at least 10 years before it conferred the boon of eligibility to the diet. As a further precautionary measure, the government reserved the right to veto the election of any urban official. Although the diets were the object of general contempt, Frederick William IV convened them again in 1841 after his accession to the throne, and he even extended their rights somewhat. But only in order to trick the creditors of the state who had been promised by the crown in 1820 that no new loans should be floated without the consent and the guarantee of the future Reich. Corporative Assembly. Johann Jacobi issued a famous pamphlet calling on the diets to demand the fulfillment of the royal promise, but he preached to deaf ears. Even the Rhenish diet gave way ignominiously, and it did so precisely on those political questions relating to the church on account of which the government had most feared it. With a 2/3 majority it rejected a demand that the illegally arrested Archbishop of Cologne should either be brought before the courts or reinstated. Although the justice of this demand was beyond discussion both from the liberal and the ultramontane standpoints, it did not even mention the question of a constitution, and it dealt in the most pusillanimous fashion with a petition signed by over 1,000 citizens of Cologne demanding the admission of the general public to the diet sessions, the publication of a daily and unexpurgated report of the diet proceedings, the right to discuss the affairs of the diet and all other provincial affairs in the press, and the issue of a definite press law in place of the censorship. All the diet did was to request the king for permission to publish the names of the speakers in its records, and instead of demanding a press law it asked for a censorship law designed merely to prevent arbitrariness in the application of the censorship. The well-earned consequence of its cowardice was a rebuff at the hands of the crown even for these modest requests. The diet showed signs of life only when it sprang to defend the interests of the landowners. The restoration of the old feudal glories was out of the question. Even the officials sent into the Rhineland from East Prussia reported that to Berlin, any attempt to do so would have aroused fierce opposition on the part of the Rhinelanders, who were not prepared to put up with anything of the sort. In particular, they were prepared to resist any interference, whether in the interests of the country gentry or in the interests of the peasantry, with the right to partition landed property at will. Although the unlimited carving up of landed property had already led to the downright atomization of the landholdings, as the government pointed out with more than a little justification, a government proposal to place certain limits on the partitioning of landed property in the interests of maintaining a strong peasantry was therefore rejected by the Diet by 49 against 8 votes. For it was in agreement with the province on this point. But after this the Diet plunged into legislation more after its own heart, and it passed a number of laws put forward by the government against wood-gathering, trespass and poaching on private lands and in the woods. The landowners in the Diet shamelessly and unscrupulously prostituted their legislative powers to their own private interests. Marx had drawn up a comprehensive plan for taking the Diet to task. In the first treatise, which was composed of 6 long articles, he dealt with the debates of the Diet on the freedom of the press and on the publication of the Diet proceedings. Permission to publish a report of the proceedings without publishing the names of the speakers was one of the reforms with which the king had tried to encourage the Diets. but he met with violent opposition from the Diets themselves. The Rhenish Diet did not go so far as the Pomeranian and the Brandenburg Diets, which flatly refused to publish any reports of their proceedings, but it too showed that stupid arrogance which would make of elected representatives higher beings secure from the criticism of the electors. The Diet cannot stand the light of day. The privacy of its own circle is better suited to it. If the province has sufficient confidence in a body of individuals to entrust them with the representation of its rights, then it is only natural that these individuals should be condescending enough to accept the honor. But it would really be going too far to demand that they should return the compliment and submit themselves, their modes of living and their characters to the judgment of the province which has just given them such a vote of confidence. With delicious humor Marx derides the first appearance of that phenomenon which he was later to dub parliamentary cretinism, a thing he hated all his life. And for the freedom of the press his rapier play has never been equalled in brilliance and trenchancy. Without envy Rouhet admitted, it would be impossible to say anything more deep or more thorough in favor of the freedom of the press. We may congratulate ourselves that such maturity, genius and such sovereign mastery over the vulgar confusion of ideas have made their debut in our press. In one passage Marx refers to the free and happy climate of his homeland, and in these articles there is, even today, still something of the brightness and warmth of the summer sun playing on the vineyards along the banks of the Rhine. Hegel once spoke of the miserable subjectivity of a bad press which would liquidate everything, but Marx reached back to the bourgeois Enlightenment movement, and in the Rheinische Zeitung he recognized Kant as the German theorist of the French Revolution. However, he went back to it, with all the breadth of political and social horizon which the historical dialectics of Hegel had opened up to him. One has only to compare the articles of Marx in the Rheinische Zeitung with Jacobi's Four Questions in order to realize what an advance the former were. Jacobi appealed again and again to the royal promise of a constitution as the alpha and omega of the whole question, whilst Marx did not consider it worthy of even a casual mention. With all his praise of a free press as the watchful eye of the people as against a censored press with its fundamental vice of hypocrisy, a vice which gave rise to all its other imperfections, including the evil of a passivity disgusting even from an aesthetic standpoint, Marx did not overlook the dangers threatening this freedom. One of the representatives of the urban property owners had demanded the freedom of the press as part and parcel of the freedom of trade, whereupon Marx demanded, is a press which degrades itself to a trade free? A writer must certainly earn money in order to exist and write, but he should not exist and write in order to earn money. The first freedom of the press must consist in its emancipation from commerce. The writer who degrades the press to a mere means of material livelihood deserves as a punishment for this inner slavery that outer slavery called censorship, unless his very existence is already his punishment. All his life Marx lived up to these principles and to the same standard which he demanded from others. A man's writing must always be an end in itself. Far from being a mere means for himself and others, he must, if necessary, sacrifice his own existence to his writings. The second treatise on the proceedings of the Rhenish Diet dealt with the Archbishop affair as Marx wrote de Jong. This treatise was blue-penciled by the censor and it was never published, although Rouhet offered to include it in his Anekdote. Writing to the latter on July 9, 1842, Marx declared, "Don't think we are living in a political El Dorado here in the Rhineland. It needs the most determined persistence to conduct a newspaper like the Rhenish Zeitung. My second article on the Diet dealing with the church troubles has been rejected by the censor. I pointed out in it that the defenders of the state had taken up a religious attitude and the defenders of the church a political attitude. The rejection of my article is all the more disagreeable because the foolish Catholics of Cologne would have fallen into the trap and the defense of the Archbishop would have attracted new subscribers. You can hardly imagine, by the way, how disgustingly and at the same time how stupidly the despots have treated the Orthodox blockhead. But success has crowned the affair. Prussia has kissed the Pope's toe before the eyes of the whole world and our governmental automatons still appear in public without blushing." The last passage refers to the fact that in accordance with his romanticist leanings Frederick William IV had ventured into negotiations with the papal curia, whereupon the latter had shown its gratitude by overreaching him right and left in the best traditions of the Vatican. What Marx writes in this letter to Rouhet about his article must not be taken to mean that Marx really undertook the defense of the Archbishop in order to lead the unwary Catholics of Cologne into a trap. On the contrary, He remained absolutely true to his principles and completely logical when he declared that with the illegal arrest of the Archbishop for having performed his religious functions and with the demand of the Catholics that the illegally arrested man should be given a legal trial, the defenders of the state had taken up a religious attitude and the defenders of the church a political attitude. It was certainly a crucial question for the Renaissance that it should adopt a correct attitude in a topsy-turvy world. Precisely for the reasons which Marx gives later on in the same letter to Rouhe, namely, that the ultramontane party, which the paper energetically opposed, was the most dangerous force in the Rhineland and that the opposition had grown far too accustomed to conducting its struggle exclusively within the church. The third treatise, which was composed of 5 long articles, dealt with the proceedings of the Diet concerning a law against the pilfering of wood in the forests. At this point Marx was compelled to come down to earth or, as he expressed the same idea in another connection, he was embarrassed by having to speak of material interests for which Hegel had made no provision in his ideological system. In fact, he did not master the problem presented by this law with the incisiveness which he would have shown in later years. The point at issue was a fight between the developing capitalist era and the last remnants of common ownership of the land, a brutal struggle to expropriate the masses of the people. Out of 207,478 penal proceedings begun in Prussia in 1836, no less than 150,000, or almost 3/4, referred to the pilfering of wood in the forests, poaching offences, trespassing, etc. During the discussion which took place in the Diet, the exploiting interests of the private landowners shamelessly forced through their claims, going even beyond the provisions of the government draft. And Marx now entered the field with caustic criticism on behalf of the unpropertied masses without political and social rights. However, his reasoning is still based on considerations of justice and not yet of economics. He demanded that the customary rights of the poor people should not be violated, and he found the basis of these rights in a somewhat vague form of property whose character was neither definitely private property nor definitely common property, but a mixture of both, such as evidences itself in all the institutions of the Middle Ages. These hybrid and vague forms of property had been abolished by applying the categories of abstract civil law taken from Roman law, but an instinctive sense of justice was embodied in the customary rights of the poorer classes, and their roots were positive and legitimate. Although the historical perception of this article bears a certain vacillating character, it nevertheless, or rather precisely on that account, shows us what in the last resort roused this great defender of the poorer classes. His description of the villainies committed by the landowners and of the way in which they trampled underfoot logic and reason, law and justice, and in the last resort the interests of the state, in order to satisfy their own private interests at the expense of the poor and the dispossessed, reveals the fierce anger against injustice which moved him. In order to destroy the poacher and the pilferer, the Diet has not only broken the limbs of the law, but it has pierced it to the very heart. On the basis of this one example, Marx wished to show what might be expected of a class assembly of private interests when once it seriously set about the task of legislating. At the same time, he still adhered to the Hegelian philosophy of law and the state, though he did not do so after the fashion of the orthodox disciples of Hegel who praised the Prussian state as ideal. On the contrary, he compared the Prussian state with the ideal state resulting from the philosophical hypotheses of Hegel. Marx regarded the state as the great organism within which legal, moral and political freedom must find its fulfillment, whilst the individual citizen obeyed the laws of the state only as the natural laws of his own reason, of human reason. From this standpoint, Marx succeeded in dealing satisfactorily with the debates of the Diet on the law against wood pilfering. From the same standpoint he could probably have dealt with the fourth treatise discussing a law against poaching and trespassing, but not with the fifth, which was intended to crown the whole work and discuss the mundane question in life size, the question of partitioning the land. Together with the bourgeois Rhineland, Marx was in favor of complete freedom to partition landed property. His attitude was that to refuse the peasant the right to divide up his property as he wished would be to add legal impoverishment to physical impoverishment. However, this legal consideration was not wide enough to provide a solution of the problem. The French socialists had already pointed out that unlimited freedom to partition landed property created a helpless proletariat and placed it on a level with the atomistic isolation of the artisan. If Marx wanted to deal with this problem, therefore, he must first come to grips with socialism. It is certain that Marx recognized this necessity, and it is equally certain that he would not have evaded it had he concluded the series. It did not, however, come to the test. By the time his third treatise was published in the Rheinesiezeitung, he was already its editor and found himself faced with the socialist riddle before he was in a position to solve it.